All right, so good evening again, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to introduce our speakers and presenters this evening, Jen Allard and Amy Hunter from our Instructional Services Mathematics Department. So I'm going to let you ladies go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Good evening, everyone. Again, as Mary Beth said, I'm Dr. Amy Hunter, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Allard and Miss Erin Silvis, who will be fielding questions in the chat. Jen is our high school specialist, and Erin is our intervention specialist, and I'm the K-12 coordinator for mathematics. We're happy that you're here tonight. We're here to share with you information about the proposed 2023 Virginia Mathematics Standards. Our agenda for tonight is to give you, first of all, an overview of the standards revision process at the state and the local level. We also want to share some big ideas about what to expect in the draft of the 2023 standards. We're going to highlight some changes, and we really want to encourage you to participate in these changes by providing your public comment. So we're going to give you some opportunities for how you can provide feedback on the changes. And we'll get started by doing a little math. Dr. Allard?
Can you flip to the slide and show the problem? So we like to start out with some math, and we'll start out with something I hope most of you will consider to be a fairly easy problem. What is 200 minus 198? And I'd like you to think about, when you get that answer, how did you do it in your head? How did you do it? Open that question. And again, maybe you didn't think about it for very long. Does it surprise you to see this work now on the screen? We often see students get very wrapped up in the computation and procedures that they've been taught and not stop to think about the fact that 200 is just 2 away from 198. And you can do that in a number of ways, but probably the last resort is to write it out and use what we call the standard algorithm for subtraction to find that answer. So let's look at another problem. This one's a little bit more involved, but kind of timely. Maybe you got to go to the beach this summer. You know, they have those candy stores all over at the beach, and you fill up a bag and they charge you by the pound. So if you went to one of these stores and bought candy that was advertised at $5.99 a pound, and they have the little scale so you don't go crazy, and you checked and it said that you had about 1.5 pounds, and you took it up to the register and they said, that'll be $11.68. I mean, the question is, are you concerned about this? Would you say anything, or would you just pay that amount? I'll let you think about it for a minute. So whether you chose to say anything to the clerk or not, or just turned over your credit card, maybe you weren't even listening because it's the beach and who cares? What we want to emphasize with a problem like this is that students, once they've learned how to estimate and multiply, should be able to recognize that it's really about $6 a pound, and 1.5 of 6 is about 9. So if I got charged $11.68, either there's some crazy taxes at the beach, or maybe the scale's wrong. But very quickly, we should be able to recognize that that number doesn't make sense. And we don't need to know what 5.99 times 1.5 is to know that. We just need to be able to see the sense in the problem. So we're talking about these problems because when we talk about standards, we get into the nitty-gritty of the exact computations and procedures that students need to be able to do. But at the end of the day, what we want students to do is to go out into the world and be able to think about math on a daily basis. So keep that in mind as we talk about this whole process and look at some examples of the standards. So we're going to start by going over just very briefly what's happening here. The standards for all content areas are revised on a 7-year cycle. That's part of the Code of Virginia. It's a required process that happens in conjunction with the VDOE, the Virginia Department of Education, and the Virginia Board of Education. That process actually takes a couple years to happen. It starts with input from educators, the community, business leaders about the existing standards. And then last summer, the VDOE convened a group of K-12 educators from across Virginia to draft a set of standards. They then went through another round of review with an advisory committee made up of more educators and community members and business leaders and university level math professors and all kinds of people. And that turned into the draft, if you go to the next slide, that was presented to the Virginia Board of Ed for first review last month. Once that happened, that then kicks off a public comment phase. So earlier in July, they opened up the public comment phase for the proposed mathematics standards. We expect that what will happen is the comments will be reviewed, changes may or may not be made, and the Virginia Board of Ed will vote to adopt new standards sometime this fall. They said probably October. Once that happens, then we as an instructional services team take those new standards and revise our own curriculum to align to the new standard. What revising the curriculum means is we update our pacing guides, which are more than just pacing. They talk about how teachers group content, what order to do it in, suggested resources, as well as assessments that we provide to teachers. But we can't really start that process until the standards are adopted because we want to be working with the actual content that is approved by the Virginia Board of Ed. As part of this process, as we go through this revision, we are keeping several things in mind. One is, if you have been following the strategic plan that's been under development for the last year or so, one of the major goals is that all students will complete Algebra 1 by 8th grade, in 8th grade or earlier. And so we're looking at using the standards revisions as an opportunity to update our curriculum for math up through grade 7 to ensure that all students are prepared to be in Algebra 1 in 8th grade, if not earlier. We also we'll talk in a minute about the standards themselves and how VDOE has worked to raise the rigor. We then can use these more rigorous standards to raise the rigor in our instruction for all students. But one question that came through for those of you that registered in advance and submitted questions, there will still be advanced math opportunities for students, and we will again use those standards to create extensions and additional rigor for students who need that at particular grade levels. The timeline for this, as I mentioned, the 2023 standards we will not see approved and adopted until at the earliest October. We have gone through and looked at places where content that if we didn't do it this year might impact students who need it next year, and are providing some guidance on what we call a crosswalk to teachers. But it won't be a completely new pacing guide or curriculum for them this year. This year, when I say this year, I mean the school year that's going to start in about a month. The 2023-24 school year, the SOL assessments in May will be on the current standards, which are dated 2016. So SOL assessments this coming school year will not change. Next summer, and probably before that, but very heavily in the summer, the Instructional Services Department will work with a group of teachers to revise the PPGs, the planning and pacing guides, as I mentioned, the pacing guides and our internal assessments to align with the new standards. And that will be for grades K through Algebra 2. And then in school year 24-25, so next school year, that new curriculum will be implemented across all of our schools for all of our teachers. And the following spring, so the spring of 2025, the new SOL assessments will be administered that will reflect the 2023 standards. So this is all happening within the next year plus that the new standards will go into effect for all students. I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to talk a little bit about the focus areas for these revisions.
Yes. One thing that our team is excited about are some opportunities for increased rigor and depth. Specifically, there are 4 areas in which we see increased rigor. One is through improved vertical coherence, and we'll show you some examples. Another is applied and connected concepts that are really connecting within a grade and within a course. Another is additional data analysis. And finally, embedded mathematics process goals and really habits of mind, how we're thinking, how students are thinking about mathematics. So the first example provides a demonstration of how vertical coherence is really improved within the standards. What you see here is in grades 1, 2, 3, and 4, a very clear connection and concepts building on each other related to computation of whole number. We also mentioned that there was greater connectivity within a course on specific topics. So for example, rather than teaching proportional reasoning only within a proportional reasoning unit, we see examples of proportional relationships that really permeate a grade level and are coming to life in different content areas. So for example, measurement and geometry, focusing on dilations, how a figure grows or shrinks, and connecting that to proportional reasoning. Another facet of the standards that we're excited about is data analysis. In the past, we've had a specific data unit that might explore graphs and using charts and using data. But the changes in the new standards really take the approach that we're building students who can really consume and analyze and interpret data in a meaningful way. It's very much focused on a data process, a data cycle, where students are working on formulating questions to explore. They're working on methods of acquiring data, organizing and representing that data, and finally analyzing and communicating the results. We feel that this is a positive change because it really equips our students to be better citizens, to be able to consume data and understand it in the real world and in their lives. Another positive change we see is that there are better verbs and adjectives used to describe how students will be demonstrating their learning and demonstrating their understanding. So for example, rather than just a student identifying a specific skill or topic, they're asked to justify and apply, explain, represent, describe, communicate, and verify. These terms help push the rigor in a classroom because students are asked to do more than just replicate a procedure or computation, and instead we're really pressing them to understand and communicate their thinking. We wanted to show you an example of how the formatting in the standards really illuminates the new rigor that we see. This is an example of a 2016 standard. You can see that it starts with students will, and then below there are specific skills that are identified. these skills are related, but we're not always needing to be taught together or in a package. Instead, they could sometimes be taught in isolation. One difference we see in the 2023 standards is that there is a cluster or an overarching sentence that really encapsulates what we're trying to see with the students thinking around a certain topic. And there's much more detail provided below the standards that really presses on the rigor. So these skills and concepts you see below cannot be taught in isolation any longer and really need to be taught together for a full depth of understanding of the content. While we're excited about the improved rigor and we know that it will be better for our students and we're engaged in that work of increasing rigor, there is one part of the standards that gives us a little bit of pause. And so Jen's going to present some of the information or facts we see in the standards as they are now.
So when Amy introduced this section about looking at the changes, VDOE has said that one of the focus areas for the new standards is increased rigor and depth. And one thing that is of concern to us is that in secondary, these are the grades 7 through Algebra 2, so typically 7th grade through 10th grade courses that represent graduation requirements for students. In 4 out of 5 of these courses, the number of standards and or the number of knowledge and skills statements, that stuff that was underneath the standard, have increased. So it's very challenging as teachers to go into more depth and develop deeper conceptual understanding of concepts when there is more to do. And we have teachers that will already tell you that in some of our courses, there is a lot to teach. And one example of that on the next page, the next slide, is in Algebra 1. And I know this is very hard to read. In a minute, we're going to give you the link to where all of this information came from. But this is a snapshot from the document that VDOE has published that highlights that's an overview of the changes in each grade level. And what you can see on the left side is there were 2 things that were deleted from Algebra 1. The first one is a very small thing. It's almost more of a parameter change than an actual deletion. The second one is a unit that we would typically spend about a week on towards the end of the school year in Algebra 1. In contrast, on the right side, there are 8 bullets of additions to Algebra 1. Again, a couple of them are fairly minor things. They're just added clarifications to the way that we might have already taught something. But the ones that have the yellow stars are things that are pretty significant content, including some things that were moved from Algebra 2 down to Algebra 1. And it creates a significant change in the amount of content and the amount of time that teachers will have available to build the foundational skills that students really need to develop in Algebra 1 in order to have success in further courses. Similarly, if you, from the previous slide, we saw increases in other middle and high school courses as well. It's not quite as drastic as the Algebra 1 in terms of what those additions are, but we are concerned about what the planning and pacing will look like for teachers with this additional content. So as I mentioned, and Erin's going to put this in the chat, all of this information is drawn from the materials that VDOE has made public on their website regarding the revisions to the standards of learning. The 2 documents that the arrows are pointing to, they're kind of hard to find because they're not highlighted on the site. There is the 2023 proposed mathematics standards of learning, that just lists all the standards from kindergarten all the way up to courses beyond Algebra 2. And they're listed the way we showed on a couple of slides ago. And then the other one is this overview of the changes. And that gives you an easier snapshot, like that Algebra 1 example of what's added, what's deleted, and what's changed in each grade level. What's also on this page are links to the opportunities to provide public comment. So what we would like to encourage you to do is to dig into these standards at a level that you're comfortable with. Maybe it's just looking at that overview and seeing how much content there it is. Maybe it's looking at grade levels that your children have just completed or are going to complete, that you're familiar with, or maybe you want to look across the board at the quantity or the language in the standards. VDOE is holding several more. They've had a couple already, public hearings. These are virtual on Zoom, where you can go on and ask questions or share your opinion about the standards. The links are on that page that Erin has shared. And then they also have a written feedback opportunity. So it's a form and you just say where you're from and just share. You can share about a specific course, or you can share about the standards overall. And they really are interested in community feedback about these standards. I don't know, we can't predict if anything will actually change, but they have expressed the administration has expressed a real interest in having community feedback. So we encourage you to participate. That's all for our formal presentation. We hope that's given you an idea of sort of what the structure of these standards are and what to look for if you're interested in reviewing them and providing comment. And we do have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions.